All right. Hello, everyone. I am very excited to be here today with Isobelle Carmody and Marianne de Pierres, two very talented and highly esteemed science fiction and fantasy writers. And we're so lucky because they are going to answer some of the questions that you had about science fiction and fantasy writing. So we're going to just get stuck right into it. So the first question I have is from Insla Banana of Worcester. And Insla Banana has asked, how do you start and how do you manage to find your own ideas? It seems practically impossible to write original fiction these days.
That's two questions, I think. So why don't you take the one you like and I'll answer the other bit, Marianne.
I'll take the new ideas bit.
Okay.
How do you start? Okay. So I'll answer the how do you start bit. Well, I don't know how everyone in the world starts. I just know how I start. And I think sometimes when you've done it a long time, people assume that you really know exactly what to do. And you do, but only for you. So the first thing is to find your way to start, to find the way that is best for you and what works for you. And that sometimes can be being in a specific spot so that you associate work with it. It can be something as simple as that, going to the same spot at the same time, doing the work. Routine is fantastic for a writer. In fact, I don't think you can exist without it. So starting, like, to set up a routine and work. And I think if you don't know how to get started, just simply writing some of the things you're thinking, like literally putting pen to paper if you do it that way, or typing, just simply writing some thoughts down so you can trick yourself into beginning in this way. I mean, presumably you have an idea, although I know that sometimes we long to write because we love it, but we literally don't have anything to write about. I just had this situation the other day, so that can happen too. I think the starting to write and seeing what comes out of your head if you're that kind of person. For me, I know what I'm going to write. I've thought about it for a really long time, and I'm really hungry to write by the time I let myself write. I think maybe the final thing I can say is that it's a clue that you've started too soon. You haven't thought enough about your idea if you run out of steam. And that's something that happens to a lot of people. They get really excited. They haven't processed their idea deeply enough. And they sit down and begin to write this exciting idea and they run out of steam really quickly. So you don't want to do that. So my way of doing it is to think a lot and process it a lot and actually talk about it to somebody, your idea, because then you get into play your natural ability to communicate as well. We're natural communicators in story, and simply telling your idea out to somebody, you can hear the flaws, you can figure out where to begin, and it's so simple. So that would be how I would begin. And again, you have to find your own way through that.
That is fantastic advice. Thank you, Isobelle.
Following on from that, I would say it is rather daunting to think in terms of how I can come up with a fresh and new idea, but I don't approach it that way. I approach it through voice. So it's really important to find your own voice as a writer, and how you tell the story then becomes the unique factor. So the same story can be told over and over again, but the way you tell it is going to be different from the way anyone else tells it. And so that would be how I would approach the whole concept of new ideas. Don't worry too much about whether the idea is new. Just look for the way that you want to tell it from your worldview, from your experiences, and you will find from that fresh ideas generate anyway.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you to you both. The next question we have is from Amalia, and her question is, how do you ground a story in reality, and is it always necessary to do so?
How do you ground a story in reality? She's talking about science fiction and fantasy, but grounding it in reality. Would that?
Yeah, so specifically for the genres.
Marianne, do you want to take that one?
Well, I guess there's a couple of ways. When I build a world, a science fictional world, I ask myself the question, what has changed and what has stayed the same? So I draw my reality from the things that have stayed the same. And that is just a case of taking small little details that people can relate to from their everyday life, and mixing them in with the fantastical ideas and the fantastical scenarios and, you know, the fantastical worlds. So that blend is what I use to ground reality. In terms of the second part of the question, Isobelle might have some more ideas to add to this, but I would say that do you, I think it was, do you need to have be grounded in reality? Is that?
Yeah, that's right.
I think it's a really interesting question, and my answer would be that I think if you want a lot of people to relate to your story, there has to be some connection back to the way that other people relate to the world. And what I'm thinking of here is there's a science fiction author in Australia who has written science fiction with no characters at all. Okay. That is actually hard to relate to. There's some great ideas. It's an interesting world, interesting concepts, but because it's very limited on reality and things we can relate to, it's harder to read. So that's probably the best way I would answer that. I think the more you can connect people to your story with these little grounding moments, the more likely they are to read to the end of the book, for a start.
Well, I guess the only thing I would add follows very strongly on from what Marianne says is that there is a constant dialogue between reality and anything you write. You live in the world, all the material you use, all the words you use are connected to reality. So inevitably you're connected. And to try to go away from that would be very difficult. For me, I agree with what Marianne said absolutely about needing to put in aspects of reality to ground your fantasy or your science fiction. And I would do it mostly through character. I would say almost what Marianne said. I would say if you have two blue dragons in a field having a cup of tea with a character who's human, the fact that one of them is very finicky about the way their tea is made, as I am, would be how I would ground it. So it's actually, it's in that little detailing that you connect to the character, but not just physical detailing of, you know, the cup of tea, but also the emotions of the character. And again, it goes back to what Marianne said about voice. I agree with voice too, but I would say that for me, the voice always has to be, the voice of the character is also really important too. And for me, beginning is trying to find the right voice for your character. And sometimes you make a mistake. You start a voice and you want to use this particular voice, but it's not the right voice. And so because you can't funnel your writer's voice beautifully through it. If you think about writers you love, I love Ursula Le Guin, and I love everything she writes because I like her voice as a writer, which is behind and in kind of informing everything, and her vision of reality is somehow shimmering underneath the story. And so as writers, we're constantly looking for that authentic voice, which is only our voice. And you can't look outward and say, what do people out there want? I think you have to find that voice inside yourself. And again, in that detailing, finding the detail, the emotional detail, or the little concrete detail of event. Like, you know what it's like when you stumble in a book across a sentence where a character says something you think, oh, they know me. And it's that identification where they've reached out and prodded you in the chest with this detail that's you. That's really strongly grabbing your reader. And I don't think what's the book you're talking about, Marianne? The one with no character? I can't even imagine that.
Greg Egan. I can't remember the name of the book off the top of my head, but he's a very revered science fiction.
He is, yeah.
And he was pushing the boundaries on how to write that kind of fiction, and it was an interesting,
It's an experiment,
interesting
of course.
story.
An
experiment. And there's very much a place for experimental fiction, but I totally agree with Isobelle about the emotional component to how we connect with our readers, or how the characters, become meaningful to readers.
Yeah, and I think for our young writers, they're looking to find a connection with their reader, and perhaps the best way to do that is through a shared human experience, as you say. So
absolutely.
No matter,
I think I think that's one of the reasons that the Ober Newton series has been so incredibly popular over the years, is because everybody shares that understanding of what it's like to be an outsider. Isobelle, would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was writing it, I simply was an outsider, and I was writing very much from anguish and loneliness and all of those things. So I was very definitely plumbing my own emotions. I wasn't thinking about the world, and I wasn't actually thinking about trying to communicate those things. I was just exploring them very deeply for myself. And I was astounded over the years at this kind of sense of recognition people had of it. And I can only say that I believe it's because I so honestly and determinedly was trying to understand it for myself, that readers can share in that experience of trying to work something out. I think that's one of the closest alignments you can have to a book, when you share in a character's experiences so strongly.
Yes. That's the authentic writer.
Yeah. So moving on to another question we have from Deria Cat, who's 15 and lives in Turkey. While writing about fantasy or sci-fi, do you ever get inspiration from yours or other people's dreams? And do you ever exaggerate the dull or ordinary things that you have experienced in real life and adapt them?
To make them interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I might take the first question if you.
Yeah, you go with it.
I know lots of writers that write stories based on their dreams, and I've had that personal experience where I had a dream which took me 4 years. I actually managed to remember it for 4 years. I kept periodically reminding myself that's what the dream was about. And it took 4 years, and then I finally wrote a short story, science fictional short story based on it. And it was really simply about a man in a space station who was called in to interrogate and investigate this alien they'd captured. And the alien was in a box. So this was a bit of a weird dream. And apparently in a box. So the story is about their conversations, and then at the end of the story you find out that actually that alien hasn't been in that box for many, many years. So he's actually having a conversation with the echo of that person. And this was a dream. So,
wow. Now, I can see why you use dreams. My dreams, first, I either don't remember them, or they're actually about being chased by a monster somewhere in some chaotic circumstance where I'm likely to be eaten. So I guess I strain the fear into books sometimes. But no, the only dream I ever had was the one out of Green Monkey Dreams, where and I dreamed of, and it was a very strange thing. It wasn't really the dream that struck me. I had a dream about little green flying monkeys trying to get in the window, another version of the monster coming to get you, which is all I ever dream about. And so I dreamed these things trying to get in the window. And I was in a school in Australia, in Mildura somewhere, speaking, and someone said that they dreamed the same kind of dream. And I thought that was odd. Then I was in America, somewhere in the heartland of America, and doing a completely different subject. And we were somehow, dreams came up, and someone started to tell me, and it was the same dream. And I just thought, this is too weird. How is that even possible?
Maybe.
So it wasn't really the dream that I wrote about. It was that strangeness of falling from a dream into a dream, that what is real and what's not, what's dream, and how do we know when we're awake? So that's what I'm doing in that. So I guess
mind control. Maybe we're all under mind control.
Now there speaks a science fiction
book in itself. Yeah. There's a book itself.
The second part of the question was about, could you repeat that, Claire?
So if you ever exaggerated the dull or ordinary things that happened to you.
Only when I'm telling stories to my friends about the weekend I had. No, not really. I like reality, and I find it really interesting, and that's where you get all your detail from. So I find that, I guess, one of the things you do when you write fantasy and science fiction is you play around in those dull moments with what if. And that what if is more interesting to me, and the grounding reality of the world is what I use to sort of to help me make that story better.
I was just telling Isobelle this morning, actually, that I was writing a story for a job that was starting to make me feel a little bored. So I locked them all in a room together and set fire to it. And then they had to find a way to get out. So yes, that would be
But I think
what.
we do that as writers all the time. We paint our characters so cleverly into a corner and we're full of glee with, ha ha, now you can't get out. And then you think, oh, wait a minute, I've got to
I
get
have
them
to get
out
them
now.
out.
Now you've set yourself a task. So Mei Zheng, who lives in New Jersey, wants to ask, how do you expand a concept and that it could be for a world, a plot, a character, into an entire story?
I think, well, for me, they come in the right form, so that if an idea comes to me, I know pretty much at once that it's going to be a story or a poem or it's going to be a novel or a series. I know very quickly. So I'm really not into expanding into. It sounds like a very lot like padding, and I'm not into that, although you might wonder given the size of my books, but I'm really not into padding. I'm into trying to get the idea as refined as possible and say it in as few words as possible. So, yeah. What about you, Marianne?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the thinking process. And like Isabelle's talked about, she does a lot of her thinking before she writes the story. And so I find that if I'm faltering at all, it's because I literally haven't done enough thinking. So I might go work on something else but continue to think about it and then come back. And so it does enlarge. The story grows organically. It's just that sometimes I haven't put enough time into it. So rather than, it's not something I plot out. It is still a very organic process, but so much of it comes from, as one of the great things about being a writer is you're never not working, because your subconscious or your unconscious is constantly processing the stories that you've got in your mind, and you need to let it do that, because it's it is one of the basic functions of writing, the writer's mind. So it will come if you put enough thought into it.
Yes, exactly. What she said.
All right, next question is from Harshita, who's 17 and lives in Atlanta, Georgia. What are the key characteristics to making dialogue seem natural instead of forced or disconnected?
Well, again, I would say authentic voice, finding the right voice for the character. And my own little rule of thumb is that dialogue is very rarely there to tell you what one character says to another. Like, you can do that much more succinctly by having a précis. I had a fight with my mother about the dishes. She had a fight with the captain about the ship. So you can tell the thing much more succinctly. So why use dialogue? It's to develop character and to have a sense of emotion and that kind of emotional connection we're talking about. So when I'm writing dialogue, it's always rising out of those things. So it's not really a forward progression. It's more like a downward, a deepening of character. So because that's how I think of it, I only introduce it where I want to go into those moments. If you've got a very action-filled story and you have some dialogue in it, it actually slows the story down. So you have to be careful how you put it in and when you put it in, with the pacing of the story as well. Marianne, what's your, how do you?
I suppose from the more technical side of it, the only thing I would add to what Isabelle said is that dialogue is a mixed. I mean, yes, it is absolutely one of the best ways to deepen characterization. You get to know the characters by the way they speak and how they interact. But it's a combination of, if you listen to how somebody speaks on an everyday basis, and you literally transcribe that would be filled with and and expletives and unnecessary words and repeated words. And in stories, we don't always have room or want to have all those extras in there. So there's an abbreviation to dialogue at a technical level that you need to kind of be aware of, and the best way to learn it is to read how other people do it.
Yes.
And so go to the books that you love and the passages of dialogue that you love, and look at how they have, abbreviated the conversations, or how they've used certain ways to deepen character, or the kinds of words. It comes down to word choice very much in dialogue. Some words which we think about in our head when we think about dialogue, when you actually write them down to read them, they're very formal, and that's really not how we would converse with each other, or that particular character would converse. So it's all about considering all those things. And I was scared of dialogue when I started writing. That was the thing I was really scared of. I love it now. I really love it.
Yeah, I love it too.
Favorite things.
Yeah.
I think also you can listen to people. Like if you transcribe what people around you are saying, you can actually see how it's not you can't use that in text. So you can begin to see, okay, I couldn't use this, and I couldn't use it because of all these things, and that you can analyze for yourself. What would you take out? And you can see how awkward. Also, you can see how conversation works, like the awkwardness, half sentences, unfinished thoughts, people finishing one another's sentences. How natural you can incorporate some of that natural aspect into your use of dialogue too.
Yeah, great. And I think, Isobelle, going back to something you said earlier, this might also be a great exercise in the reading aloud for dialogue.
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah, to just, it's one thing to write down conversation, but then to actually listen to it, you could find out a lot. All right.
Yes, and
well,
we do, as Isobelle said, we constantly interrupt each other, like I just did then, Claire. I just interrupted you. See, we're having a very natural conversation.
Our Skype delay. Yes, exactly. That was a great example there. All right. Next question is from Pollyanna Nguyen, and she is 17 from Vietnam. And Pollyanna asks, when you picture new characters, are the first things that come to mind their appearance or their characteristics?
Well, when I think of Marianne's Peacemaker, I think of the character first. Like it's a cowgirl character in the middle of kind of like a futuristic Perth that's also not futuristic at all, or WA, Western Australia. And I have my own vision of what that character looks like. I think if I looked at Marianne's book, I would find that a lot of what I imagine is not written into the character. And I think one of the things you can do as a writer is not too strongly identify what a character looks like. Like for me, when I write, people often say, oh, you must have had a really strong picture of a character. Actually, the opposite is true. What I have is a cluster of words that produce a certain emotion in me. And the cluster of words for the character of Dragon or the character of Elspeth, there's certain words that are associated with those characters that resonate to what their emotions are like. And so, yeah, I would use those words because that evokes for me those characters, and that produces a response in a reader where they come up with their own picture. Less is more in a way, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I would totally agree. Yeah.
Right. Next up, we are hearing from Khadija Zara from Pakistan. And Khadija's question is how to construct plots and avoid overused tropes, which is a big question.
And what was the first half?
How do you go about constructing a plot?
Constructing a plot. Marianne, do you want to take that?
Well, I don't. How does that go?
That's why I tried to give it to Marianne, because I don't either. I mean, so in that case, the best thing to say is for me, I think about an idea for a long time and it begins to organize itself, doing what Marianne talked about before, dipping in and out of my consciousness. It goes down into my mind. I don't think about it for a while. I draw it up and it's saturated with my life. And some of that is unexpected and some of that things I didn't even remember that I remembered. And so then it begins to grow. And it grows, I think it's organic and fluid and very alive until the minute you start to write, which is why you should hold off until your head is so full of it you can hardly see the real world.
Yeah.
So that's yeah.
I would add that as writers, published writers, we're often asked to write a synopsis of our story, which is essentially the plot. And pretty much 99% of writers would then completely stray from that. And
Right.
it wouldn't, the end result would be nothing like the synopsis. So having said that, if you're writing something like a crime story where you're plotting, clues and red herrings, there are writers out there that do meticulously plot where things will happen in chapter or even write chapter breakdowns. And the thing is, there is no right answer. I think you have to find how your mind works. Isobelle and I both like to do the thinking and then write and see what happens and what characters come along and what twists and turns happen out of the story as we write it. But there are few writers out there who will meticulously plot, but I feel that even with them, they must allow some room for variation, because one of the things that I find about plotting too carefully is that I get bored.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
part of the discovery, go on.
Well, if you solve it all in the plot, that's perfectly said. If you solve it all in the plotting, what's the point of writing the book? It's like you read the end
Exactly.
and you don't want to read the book anymore.
It's true.
Yes,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah. And
I
I
mean,
think,
but not everyone works, but a lot of writers do work that way. I think that they want to find out the end when the end comes as well.
Yeah.
yeah,
But I think there is a space for when you're working, at some points you need to work something out. So I sometimes do some mini plotting somewhere in there when I've decided something and I need to make something happen and I'm trying to work it out. So I would do that kind of on the hop while I'm writing, just as a little sidestep rather than a big effort. And that's just to clearly think something through for myself. So I think we do plot, but in different ways, and not in that grant. But as Marianne said, some people plot every single thing. I don't know how they can do it, but they do.
Yeah.
and I think for our young writers too, will be so helpful for them to hear you say this, because I think for many young writers, the example is very structured. It's a more academic kind of writing, like the 5-paragraph essay where you do have to plot. And
Yes.
of course, creative writing isn't necessarily like that. Some people are structured in their creative writing, but as you say, many writers are finding out as they go along, and you've got to sit down and go on that journey with your characters. So,
but there is some plotting from the back too. Like when you work
yeah.
like we do, once you've got the story, then you have to go and have the backfill where you've discovered this doesn't make sense and you've got to work this out better. So there's a lot of plotting once the thing's there in front of you. So it can be that back end plotting as well.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. I like to. I love. First draft is the hardest thing of all. It's so exhausting mentally. That straight creation onto the page. I love going into the rewrite phase, because that's
me too.
that's when it's that's when you get to kind of play with the clay,
Yeah.
Because you've now got it in front of you.
Yes.
There's now some clay to play with.
Yes.
Exactly.
That's fantastic. All right. This is an interesting question. It's from Joshua Haley of Northamptonshire in England. He has asked, what is your view of the future 200 years from now? And how, and if you do have that view of the future, Do you use this idea to strengthen your science fiction and fantasy writing?
He's asking for prognostication.
Prophesizing.
I like playing with end of the world scenario. So that I destroy the world a lot in my writing, partly because I'm interested in how things break down and what will come afterwards, how things grow out of ashes. So because I'm interested in that, that's what I go. That's my go-to. So I find myself constantly imagining, if this was tomorrow, looking out this window at Melbourne, what would it be like? You know, if a bomb dropped or if the seas rose, where would they go to? So I would be playing in this light, playful way with that idea a lot, and it gets into my writing a lot. Yes, but knowing what the future is, God, I hope it's going to go up into the light rather than down into the dark.
Yeah. The first series I wrote, the very first novel I ever published was called Null and Angel, and it was a 3-book series. And in that, the way I don't have a holistic view of the future as such. Like I have many views of the future, I guess, but they usually grow out of one aspect of the present. So in that particular series, a couple of things I focused on. One of them was that there was no government anymore as such, and that the media controlled the country. So this was written back in 2004, and they used these vehicles called priors. The journalists would be mounted in the prior, and they'd fly around and drop down into your living room and when you were eating your breakfast and that sort of thing. And they were really drones. So, and the other thing that I looked at in that series was that it was set on the east coast of Australia, that there was no longer individual cities, but that we had one mega city that extended down the extent of the east coast. And so there's aspects of the future that I look at rather than having a really fully formed view. And for me, in terms of prophesizing or prognosticating, it was interesting then to see 15 years later to see drones being used commercially, and people writing scientific papers about the mega city on the east coast. And so that's some of the really fun stuff with science fiction, is to fool around and then sit back and see, well, where is the world actually going?
Yeah, but also the world can catch up and overtake you too. Back when I was imagining telepathy in my characters as a way of having them speak to one another, now mobile phones came along and you just think, is there any point really in telepathy now? So it changes, doesn't it? So the world can overtake you. But your imagination, I think, for people like us, your imagination is always stretching forward, extrapolating, wondering what's going to happen. And it's always this forward-looking, what will happen next in the world. Again, it's that writing is a response to the world in many ways. And then we take in how the world changes. And in our next pieces of writing, we absorb that too. So, it's a constant thing.
I actually was very fortunate to sit on a panel this year about robots within our, robots that actually are in service. What they call it, robot servants, was actually the name of the title of the panel. But it was about robots being used to help the elderly and the kinds of connections that people make with these, these robot servants in their home, and how people actually do, they
form relationships.
Form real genuine affection for these robots, as long as they don't look too human. Apparently, if they look too human, that's a bit too creepy. But, who would have, the whole idea of robotics can go in so many different directions, but here it is actually now being used at a commercial level to assist the elderly. So it's really interesting to have ideas and then see actually where the reality takes you.
Yeah. This next question, a number of people have asked versions of the same question. So I'll read out everyone's question, then we can do a collective answer. So we have Lamno of the UK ask, on the days you don't feel like writing, what motivates you to keep going? Emma Crow from New Zealand has asked, how do you find the motivation to finish writing a book? And Rin Lee of Illinois has asked, as a writer, how do you remain confident in your story and the world of your story long enough to see it completed? Endurance questions.
Yes, endurance. Well, if there's one thing we're good at, isn't it, Isobelle, is enduring.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also it's if you love what you do, and we do, we spend half of our life, our conversation as two human beings, Marianne's and mine, flows seamlessly back and forward so that it would confuse people between what we're going to do next or where we're going to go, what we're going to do, and also into character and a plot we're talking about. And so, and we refer to those things in one another's lives too. So you live inside your character. For me, it goes back to the very first thing we said, which was, how do you get an idea in the first place? Once the idea is that strong, it draws you. It's this magnetic draw. And you can sit down, like one of the things I do to inspire myself is read someone whose writing I like. If I just don't feel very inspired that day, or all I have to do is I carry around always a few books with me, and they're books I've read a million times before. And I take one out because I don't need to know what's going to happen because I already know. I will just read to get the flavor, and it's inspiring to me. And if I'm deeply into my own book, it isn't long before I'm sick of reading and I want to write again. So reading great writing, but not writing that I've never read before, because then you get caught up in that story. Helps me to get in the mood. So that's one of the things. And also just simply discipline, sitting down regularly, working in the same place, sitting down, trying to go forward a little bit, leave your last sentence halfway complete. So you've got to complete it as the first thing. So you trick yourself into beginning, leave yourself in the middle of something exciting rather than, you have this tendency, I'll finish this chapter. Don't finish it. Finish it a paragraph before the end. And that gives you a little bit of time to process it, let it go down into the dark of your mind and see what unusual things might come up, but also you're there with something ready to start with, and so you're already beginning. That would be how I would say the endurance question could be answered. What about you, Marianne? What are your tricks?
Yeah, look, the only thing I would add to that is that over the years I've found that going to writers' conventions or writers' festivals or just having a writing group to be part of is incredibly nourishing and sustaining, and I always come away inspired from those kinds of, connections. And it, if I'm flagging at all, I know that there's people I can reach out to out there who will just make me feel that what I'm doing is worthwhile, and that, that it's okay. But the other trick I have used a lot is not to think to the end of a book. I only think to the next page. If you start on page 1 and it's going to go to page 385 or 585, that's daunting. So don't think that way. Just go little bite-sized pieces.
Yeah. I think the other thing too, which might be helpful for the young writers, I think all artists, you don't always enjoy every single aspect of your artwork, and I think there's your job, right? And I think there's this misconception out there that it's your passion and you're loving every part of it, and I don't know whether either of you have any particular example you could share of a part of the book that was really hard, or some work you were working on that was not going the way you planned.
Oh, for me, the one that I don't suffer writer's block very much, but for me, the one that really comes to mind when anyone asks that kind of question is when I was writing The Gathering. There's a really dark, horrific scene in The Gathering, the worst scene I've ever written. And when I was before I wrote that, the book was about friendship, and I was modelling one of the characters on my youngest brother. And at some point, his house burned down and his best friend was killed in the fire. And I just felt like I had somehow written this into being. So it was silly and superstitious, of course. I didn't really believe it. It was just something that was in my mind. But it was so awful and so traumatic. And watching him go through that awful trauma, I just felt like I didn't want to write that book anymore. And I stopped for a really long time. And it was what Marianne said a few minutes ago about friendship. I was outside a class waiting to go in John Marsden was outside a class waiting years ago when we were both, first starting out. And he asked me what I was working on, and I told him this book and said, but I think, I think I should set this aside, and because I don't think I can work anymore. And he said to me, "Are you crazy? That sounds like a fantastic idea." And he was so enthusiastic. And I said, I don't know what I said, but I remember he said, "I love fantasy and science fiction that's borderline with reality." He said, "I love going along that border." And it was like my skin went into goosebumps, and I knew where to go with the story. And I went back and I ended up going into it. So sometimes life and friendship and anything that will help you process the moving forward. And it's so deep in you, you process it in 1,000 different ways, these moments. If it's a deep enough story, if it's not a deep enough story, the first minute you come to a hit, you think, "Oh, I'll do something else." And you know it wasn't deep enough.
The only, probably for me personally, I'm like Isobelle, I don't suffer writer's block a lot. But I started writing when I had 3 small children, so fatigue was my enemy. And I literally, I think I had like a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old or something like that. So whenever I feel like I'm struggling, I look at myself and say, "Am I tired? Do I need to go have some fun? Do I need to go dancing with my friend Isobelle?"
Yeah, we dance off a lot of energy.
Good. This is a good activity for writers.
I think exercise, being physical, can be an antidote to, thinking all the time, being in your head all the time. So there's a horrible expression in business called sharpening the saw, but it's about, making yourself feel better if you're a bit worn down. And I think that it doesn't matter what age you are, you can use that, like go do something that's fun, and then all that spark and that love and that passion will come back.
Yeah, and you pour it into your piece of writing, and possibly some of the events that happened while you were having fun.
While you were dancing. Well, Isobelle and Marianne, this has been so wonderful to talk to you. I feel like I've learned a lot about writing too, and you're both such an inspiration to our young writers. So we're really excited to have you for our workshop, and we're all looking forward to working with you.
Thank you. I can't wait to read the stories.
Thank you again.
Bye. Thanks, Claire. Bye.
Thank you.
Claire.
Bye.
Bye, Marianne.
Bye.